My dear friends and comrades, colleagues, I want to first of all say how happy I am to have received an invitation from my friend Dr. Vincent, who's the director of Cipriani College of Labor and Co-operative Studies, and to speak with you on the situation and context analysis of the Caribbean, an overview of the challenges of governance. It's a very wide subject, and I will restrict myself to certain central matters which I consider to be appropriate at this particular time in our history, in our Caribbean. I want, by way of backdrop, indicate that the party which I head is the Unity Labour Party. And the word labor in it means simply that we focus on those who labor. We focus on the producers of wealth, the ordinary men and women who make things happen, the entrepreneurs, the creative personalities, the scientists, the managers, everyone who comes together to make life, living, and production much better. I have dedicated my life to addressing the issues and concerns of the poor and the working people, the nation as a whole, and our Caribbean civilization, and make links in internationalist solidarity with like-minded groups and persons overseas. I consider that the best way we can analyze whatever is happening wherever in the world is to look at the issue from the standpoint of working peoples, not persons who extract wealth, but persons who create wealth, who make sure that collectively that our civilization is a place worthy of all our efforts. I don't say this politically. 2 years ago in 2019, I say so also from an academic standpoint, a research standpoint. I wrote a book called The Political Economy of the Labor Movement in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and looked at the political economy of our country through the eyes of the working people and the labor movement. You know, you can look at it through the eyes of the powerful and the rich. Well, that's one perspective. But I believe you get a better view, a better perspective on the real world if we examine what we are doing from the ground level, to look at the milieu, the real economic circumstances and the structures and systems from which and out of which human activity emerges. The challenges in contemporary governance arise from multiple sources. And there's an interesting essay which I wrote. I delivered a speech in 2016 at the University College of the Cayman Islands, which is the lead essay in this book called Our Caribbean and Global Insecurity. There are 7 essays in this book. And I want to read what I said then, which constitutes part of the background as to the challenges of governance. I said then, among the principal challenges of governance and also of global insecurity are the following: contradiction and crises of global capitalism and other extant economic arrangements, economic dominance and resistance, inequality and poverty, adverse climate change and its consequences, the spread of nuclear weapons and the arms race generally, the pursuit of power grounded in ideology, the quest for hegemony based on religion, the turmoil in governance arrangements in several countries, including the clash between the old order and rising insurgents. We see examples of that in the Middle East with the Arab Spring. We see it with the Occupy Wall Street movement. We see it with Black Lives Matter, and so on and so forth. Other factors, other challenges to governance: the push for territorial aggrandizement, the defense of sovereignty, independence, or territorial integrity, the battle between localism and regionalism on the one hand, and the forces of globalization on the other, problematic demographic trends, including the alterations in the internal composition of populations. In all these islands, in all the world, we are having the over 65 age group being the fastest growing segment of the populations. And this fact has serious implications for life and living and production. The discontents attendant upon the use, misuse, and abuse of modern technology, including information technology, large-scale migration, including the upsurge of refugees and asylum seekers, the spread of infectious diseases globally, like, for instance, COVID-19, the perpetration of crimes such as trafficking in illegal drugs and arms, corruption on a grand scale, human trafficking, serious crimes and violence, and money laundering and terrorism, both domestic and international. If one looks, we see that 25 years or so ago, 30 years, the received wisdom in the citadels of academia and governments in Europe and North America was that the collapse of centrally planned regimes in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe would usher in an era of peace and shared prosperity, presided over by Pax Americana, with support from allies in Europe and elsewhere. The celebrated American social scientist Francis Fukuyama even proclaimed the much trumpeted triumph of Western liberal democracy and the free enterprise system over what is called Soviet totalitarianism and socialism as the end of history. Within a short time, the very arrogance of such a proclamation about the end of history ran headlong into the real world, in which the presumptive hegemony of a sole superpower, the United States of America, was challenged on several fronts by multipolar power centers, around which clusters of economic and political activities of growing significance were made manifest. And at the level of the global economy, China, India, Russia, Brazil, Japan, South Africa, Mexico, Argentina, Turkey, Indonesia, along with an expanding European Union, placed severe limits on America's economic preeminence within the context of a rampaging globalization, which benefited American corporations and their shareholders, but not necessarily the American people as a whole. And as you know, that was a big issue for Donald Trump, about globalization not benefiting the working people in America as a whole. In the process, China became the world's second largest economy, within a touching distance of overtaking that of the United States of America in aggregate terms. Now, while all that is taking place and the challenges to this idea of a unipolar world with America at its pinnacle, and we see those challenges on all fronts. In Eastern Europe and Russia, the formal centrally planned economies, they haven't really yet arrived at a settled economic stability. And a major governance issue for us is inequality globally and inequality within our countries in the region. Unfortunately, in some countries, the extent of the inequality is growing wider. There's a period in which you had a certain movement towards a more equal kind of internal arrangements. But in the United States, in Britain, here in the Caribbean, we see much of that being reversed. And part of this is because with the rise of Thatcherism and Reaganism in the late 1970s, in the 80s, they actually thought that the market economies would provide the basis for the creation of wealth and to bring about a greater equality. Well, that hasn't happened. In fact, the market economy has had a kind of survival of the fittest and simply has made life difficult for the poor. And unless a government takes particular strategic interventions to assist the poor and the working people, you find this continued inequality or deepening inequality, creating lots of problems for governance. We have noticed an increased centralization in banking and finance capital globally. And a kind of casino capitalism has grown up, and they're setting the rules in the world. And in a modern period, using the banking and finance capital to establish, as best as they can, cross-border alliances between various countries for domination. And again, making life difficult for countries like the Caribbean and the periphery. Especially in the Caribbean, we have certain historical legacies which are enduring, legacies which came out of the period of colonialism, governor-type rule, social disorder based on ethnicity, problems which came out of native genocide and the enslavement of Africans. And though we have moved with great tolerance towards a creolized society in the Caribbean, and where race doesn't play as central a role as hitherto, we nevertheless see that a set of Eurocentric values still hold undue sway in ways which do not facilitate liberation, but which, in a sense, limit people's individual opportunities and as groups to retard their own progress and development. And out of you take communities which, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, of the Kalinago and the Garifuna, the indigenous peoples, and one sees the contemporary legacy of native genocide, and also in certain communities, both urban and rural, where people are still struggling to come to terms with the legacy of the enslavement of Africans and also of Indian and even Portuguese indentured labor. Of course, for many young persons, they may not look at these issues as having an impact because many are so absorbed with what happens on Facebook and what happens on the internet, Instagram and the like, and don't give a sufficient reflection on these things. But a moment's thought will tell you that these matters are still of the moment, not just a residue, but a historical legacy of these challenges, which we, if we are honest, we have to struggle with on an ongoing basis in the society as a whole. Now, the technology is a double-edged sword. It can help individuals and strengthen people's connections with one another globally, but at the same time, because there is a culture which is promoted, that very culture itself is controlling a kind of a dominant cultural response to so many things that people don't even realize that they're being controlled by that which itself potentially can be liberating, that is to say, the technology. But more important at the workplace is not just the question of trying to free our minds from mental slavery, which peculiarly the modern technologies themselves seem to reinforce because of this quest for a uniform cultural hegemony and set of values and how people should behave and the like. And we see it in all different forms. The real challenge for working people as we go forward, and for the whole country, the whole of each of these countries, is automation on the workforce and the social organizations which spring from automation and the reorganization of the workforce, and the implications for this, for the labor movement too. The future of the workforce is likely to undergo immense changes over the next 30 years, with profound implications for people's livelihoods and for security and stability. There's a document which I read, Ministry of Defense document from the United Kingdom government, published in 2014 in its 5th edition, entitled Strategic Trends Program, Global Strategic Trends out to 2045. And in addressing the issue of automation and work, this is what the document says. Robots or unmanned systems, machines, capable of carrying out complex tasks without directly involving a human operator, are likely to be ubiquitous in 2045 as computers are today. Notice, robots or unmanned systems, machines capable of carrying out complex tasks without directly involving a human operator, are likely to be ubiquitous everywhere by 2050 as computers are today. Unmanned systems are increasingly likely to replace people in the workplace, carrying out tasks with increased effectiveness and efficiency while reducing risk to human beings. This could ultimately lead to mass unemployment and social unrest. As robots become more lifelike, perhaps capable of appearing to express emotion, interactions with people are likely to become more sophisticated. The increased capacity of robots is likely to change the face of warfare, with the possibility that some countries may replace potentially large numbers of soldiers, sailors, and airmen with robots by 2045, 2050. It's already beginning to happen. And the kind of training which we're getting in the Caribbean, we have to make sure that by 2050, that people whom we're training now would be fit for the workforce. People who are entering primary school right now, by the time they're 45, 50, what kind of work they would be doing? I wouldn't be alive to see it, but it's going to be a very different world than it is today. And you have to develop skills which are relevant, not just technical skills, but the kind of skills where you can deliver personal service which may not necessarily be automated. Because a lot of other work which are done by human beings today are going to be done by machines then. So, I mean, we have an ability, an increased ability to invent new things, but we can't quite get the hang of how do we civilize these things which we are creating to make them work for us. And that's a problem which starts to affect governance now and will increasingly in the future. I mean, you may develop a piece of technology now and it takes you 10, 15 years before you develop a consensus on what it means and the etiquette that you use, that you have to tame this particular technology. And then routine, normal challenges to governance are those which we have inherited from our Westminster system of governance. Divisiveness in politics. We are seeing right now this problem. Every opposition party in the Caribbean and the world has a solution how to deal with COVID-19. They tell you all the simplest solutions, but the solutions are not simple. They're complicated. But because of the nature of of opposition politics, competitive politics, whatever position you take, they have to take the opposite one in order to see if they have any currency. And their simple objective is to get those who are in office out of office so that then they will replace them. Doesn't mean that they have any idea as to what to do. And if you pay attention to it as a leader, you really don't get anything done. All you have to do is just do what you have to do what you think is right, and let the real world take care of what will happen, what will emerge, and don't be afraid in any way at all to lose office. It's becoming more and more complicated too in the governance to make sure you consult with all the various stakeholders, the private sector, the trade unions, the NGOs, locally and globally, and then of course you have all this work feeding in from social media. And everybody wants to have a say. The challenge is to give a say, make sure, not just give it, but let it be structured into your governance. But you as the government, you have to accept that government is not a continuing university seminar where you talk things to the death, because there are people in NGOs and on social media and in opposition parties and even some in the private sector. They would want to talk a subject to the death and no decisions are ever taken. And a kind of paralysis ensues. And everybody suffers. But of course, if you decide to cut the discussion short, you may be called a dictator or worse. Now, the issue of leadership is therefore very critical in all of this. I don't know, there are people who seem to think that leaders must follow. A peculiar thing. They say they want leadership, but really they don't want leaders, they want followers. Follow what I'm saying. What's trending, I think, is the new formulation. And you just fall in line with what is trending. But you know, I take the wisdom from Paul in the book of Romans, address the question very eloquently. And at this time of COVID, it's even more important. Paul advised that teachers must teach, prophets must prophesy, and leaders must lead. And you have to be clear in your mind that you have a position. It is true that leaders themselves do not by themselves make history or make things happen. Because the leaders function within a particular context and the leader is constrained by a number of forces. But the leader can, in communion with others, make things happen if you're determined on a particular course of action and reasonably you persuade people. You're in communion with them and you persuade them of the correctness of what you're doing. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we have a lot of vaccine hesitancy. At first, when the AstraZeneca vaccine came, they said, well, you know, there's some questions about it. Let's get the Russian vaccine. That one is not driven by profit. You know, let's get the Sputnik. You get it, and then there's another story about that, and then there's some other vaccine and so on. And there's so much. I mean, we have a global pandemic, but we also have an infodemic with a lot of foolishness being spoken and written about the vaccine. The fact of the matter is that the vaccine is the most important tool in the toolbox against COVID. And if we don't get this virus under control in each of our countries and in the world, we're going to have continued challenges with our health, our economy, the social order, including education, and of course security. And the most obvious thing in security, as we've seen in some countries, a lot of policemen coming down with COVID, and therefore they can't carry out their work effectively to protect people and to maintain order. And a lot of it is driven, a lot of the opposition to the vaccine is driven by ignorance, some of it by just people who want to challenge authority, and some of it is just pure opposition politics. But in order to pay the bills, the economy has to be open, you have to run it. And in opening the economy, there's danger of more people coming in with COVID. And that is why everybody inside of the country has to be take the vaccine to get the level of population immunity so that you can lay the basis for further economic development, all things being equal. The institutions of government are under challenge because if you have even the law courts, somebody doesn't win a case, a political organization or group, they don't win a case in the law court, they think it's that justice was not done. Justice defined through their own eyes, and they criticize everybody. The judges, the magistrates, the director of public prosecution, they just go at every single authority. Well, if you do that on an ongoing basis, disorder will simply be the order of the day. And working people will suffer because we need the law to help working people, to protect them from powerful and even nefarious forces who want to do them harm. I am optimistic about our region because by and large we have a very good trained population. We have people overwhelmingly who are very serious and balanced and reasonable. But we have to have these individuals working together more assuredly. If not, you're going to have not rationalism guiding public policy, but superstition and ignorance. And once you allow that to happen, there are no more standards. And COVID has brought this issue very much to the fore with the challenges of governance. And for those who advocate a pristine abstract individualism and clothe it with a bundle of quote-unquote individual rights, ignore completely social solidarity, ignore the public interest, including the right of persons not to be negligently or recklessly infected by others. And of course, they ignore the importance of public health during a pandemic, during a public health emergency. And strangely, those who are affirming this pristine, atomized, A-T-O-M-I-S-E-D, atomized individualism, devoid of any social connection, they think that's progressive, but it's the height of backwardness. I mean, in living memory, you can identify the most individualistic or atomized individual as Howard Hughes, a rich man who was so isolated himself from people that he wanted to have somebody taste the food because he's always fearful that somebody's going to do him something, but thinking only of himself. Now the world can't function like that. All what we do, we have to do in social solidarity. Now, another trend and problems with governance in the region is that nowadays anybody who loses an election thinks that the election is stolen. We see it with Donald Trump. We see it in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We see it in even Trinidad. I've read things about it. I've seen Dominica, everywhere. And you go to court and the court says, no, the elections are free and fair. They say, nah, the coat is in the pocket of the Prime Minister or something of the sort. And there are people who would want to metaphorically burn every institution to the ground. But if they who want to do that inherit this wasteland, what are they going to do with it? And all of these things too are connected to the question of scarcity of resources and people fighting for scarce resources. And that's why always it is important to ground ourselves in a set of values revolving among the working people who create things, who create wealth, and who are reasonable broadly in their approach to life, living, and production. In our country, we have had to do a number of very creative things to keep our economy going together. We never closed down at the time of COVID. We never had a state of emergency. We used the tools of identifying early the virus, contact tracing, testing, quarantine and isolation, and put certain regulatory things in place. And of course, now that COVID is here, we seek to use the law. And that the vaccine is here, we seek to law not as a sword against people, but as a shield to protect people. But even while you do so, you generate the controversies which I've been talking about, which are not grounded in truth or science, but in superstition and opportunism. One-fifth of our population we had to evacuate. Think of this, 1/5 of the population in the United States would be 70 million people. Imagine evacuating the people of New York State, of Connecticut, of New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. That's what we had to do here, comparably, and not one person got injured. It speaks to the level of organization which the society itself has, and the role of the government, the leadership role the government plays in it, in this organization. But people have to be fed. People have to be housed. We're getting the money for all of this. And we have had to be very creative in being able to pay our bills and to keep our revenue losses to a minimum. In fact, in this year, our revenues are up by about 13% for the year over last year. Though, of course, our expenditure, because of what we had to spend on COVID and on the volcano and its consequences, that expenditure has ballooned and we end up running a deficit. It's manageable. But the downside to that, because you protect, for instance, public workers' wages and their pensions and so on and so forth, they feel that everything is fine and dandy and there's nothing wrong at all with the country, and the COVID is a hoax, and you get all that kind of ridiculous nonsense, and it's Bill Gates who wants you to take the vaccine, and they're in quest of hegemony, and they're like rich people over the world. A lot of foolishness. But of course, if people start to die, people get very sick and the hospital is overrun, well, then you may get a different song being sung. Andrew Vincent asked me to mention something about my own personal way of leading. Well, it's quite straightforward. Articulate, first of all, a vision, a people-centered vision. Have a philosophy of social democracy applied to our circumstances in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. You have a well-developed rubric of the culture of our Caribbean civilization to ground us with all its values and all its nobility. And then to have an economic framework of building, having a quest to build a modern, competitive, post-colonial society, post-colonial economy, which is at once national, regional, and global, and therefore regionalism and international solidarity become part of the very model itself of building a modern, competitive, many-sided post-colonial economy. Post-colonial economy means you have to do things in a more competitive manner, you have to do them of higher quality, and don't look for preferences to hold you in the marketplace. And this framework speaks to the importance of science and technology and education, and to issues of health and housing and building the physical infrastructure and a modern electricity and telephone system, and social safety nets to protect the poor and the indigent. And you have that kind of a framework, and you are just straightforward and honest, and you lead as best as you can in communion with people. And that's the answer in going forward. That's what we have tried to do with Last of Red. That's why we tried to do it with COVID, and that's what I've been trying to do for the last 20 years or more since I've been Prime Minister, since I first became Prime Minister in March 2001. In a nutshell, in easy conversational style, that is how I see the issues which are before us. The place is complicated, the world is complicated, but we have to make sense of it by being rational and building appropriate alliances, and not to duck difficult decisions, because I've always felt that those who are afraid to lose power tend to lose it swiftly, and those who fear not tend to hold it longer, because you do things eventually that people see what are the results of the work you're doing. And always to make sure that the wages and working conditions of the working people, and they get in housing, that you take the basic needs, and you provide an education and training to permit them to use their God-given abilities and to advance, and to do so within a democratic frame. You do this, there are challenges, to be sure, but you will overcome them in communion with the people and with God's mercies. I'm sorry I have to record this conversation and not to have it before you so that you can ask me questions. But hopefully in another day, another time, I'd be able to do it. I wouldn't be, on the 17th, I will be traveling to Mexico to attend the Heads of Government Summit of this Community of States of Caribbean and Latin America and the Caribbean, CELAC. And therefore, I wouldn't be with you. And I'm sure that Andrew will have this played over, and you have a conversation around it, and I can join you some other time, some other occasion, just simply to answer your questions. Thank you very much. God bless you.